Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to another wonderful tasting with the Virtual Tasting Society. My name is Vadim Perlovsky, and today we are excited to taste and learn all about apple brandy. Welcoming back to our group is the wonderful Caitlin Bartlemay. Thank you very much for joining us again. If you
Thank you
remember,
for
she did.
tolerating me for a third time.
Well, third and hopefully not the last. We're always a pleasure to have you. Thank you very much for being here. Those of you who remember, Caitlin introduced us to fruit brandies back in the summer, and then we had her back for bourbon and single malt. Bourbon, what were the two brands again?
That was Trails End and McCarthy's American Single Malts.
That's right. Those are both delicious. And McCarthy's, if I remember correctly, is the first American single malt, right?
You are correct.
Yes, a lot of fans of that in the group. And I very much enjoyed Trails End, and I'm excited that we're tasting it again today. That was my favorite expression. So tonight we are super excited to go deep into the world of apple brandy. Some of you may know it as Calvados. So think Calvados, but just made in the proud home of the United States.
Yeah.
Up in beautiful Oregon.
Well, so that you don't have to listen to me drone on and talk about apple brandy with nothing in your glass, we have a little bit of a primer, which is kind of a really great connection from the last one we did with the bourbon and the American single malt. And then I brought back the Trails End apple brandy finish. So that's what we're going to start with first. It is a bourbon. Sourced in Kentucky and then brought here to Oregon. The Trails End line is a Kentucky bourbon, either 8 or 10 years old, and we are tasting order. Yeah, so we're gonna go the Trails End apple brandy finish, Old Delicious, 2-year, 8-year, the 12 and 13-year-old blend, and then finishing up with the 15-year apple. So if you guys want to get those in order, but we're gonna go ahead and start with the Trails End bourbon apple brandy barrel finish. So like I said, the Trails End sourced Kentucky bourbon, we're putting Pacific Northwest culinary finishes on. And since we're talking about brandy and specifically apple brandy, and with that being a little bit of a gray area where not a lot of people know a lot about that category, I thought, wouldn't it be great if we go ahead and start with bourbon and kind of walk our way into it very slowly. And then for those of you that haven't met me before, just a quick introduction. My name is Caitlin Bartlemay. I'm the head distiller for Clear Creek Distillery here in Hood River, Oregon. Clear Creek Distillery was founded by a man named Steve McCarthy. He started Clear Creek with the idea of focusing on using the bounty of Pacific Northwest fruits, turning them into beautiful fruit brandies, mirroring the classical and delicious European fruit brandies that he had fallen in love through his travels as a young man, and ended up starting the third craft distillery in the country in 1985 behind St. George and Germain Robin. In 2014, he was looking to retire, sold the distillery to Hood River Distillers, which is the oldest distillery in Oregon, being founded in 1934. And with the purchase of Clear Creek, it was the return back to their distilling roots, making pear and apple brandies from fruit from the Hood River Valley. So it's been kind of a full circle for Hood River Distillers. We turn 90 this year, so that's kind of awesome. And Clear Creek turns 40 next year. I have been very fortunate that I got to work for 4 years under Steve McCarthy before the sale, and I have been with the brand for 14 years. So it feels like no time and forever at the same time. So I've got a lot of really fun tidbits to share about apple brandy. Feel free to throw questions into the chat. I will try to glance down when I see them pop up. But if I don't get to your question, make sure that you ask it at the end, because I don't want you to miss out this opportunity to learn more about this category. So again, we're starting with the Trails End 8 apple brandy finish. The sourced Kentucky bourbon is a really beautiful Kentucky bourbon. It has all these great, roasted corn, vanilla, dark chocolate, kind of things that you would expect from a really good bourbon. But what we're doing with these finishes is we're highlighting highlighting kind of quieter spaces within the bourbon that maybe are a little bit harder to pull out when you're smelling and tasting them. So with this apple brandy finish, what we're highlighting is all the like fruity and floral notes that we're already hiding in that bourbon. We're just bringing them towards the surface. This is actually bottled at 105 proof. So it's got a head of steam on it. It's a little hot, but it's a really beautiful way to showcase what a little bit of an apple brandy finish can do to an already really great bourbon. She says you should just pull the chat up so I can see it a little bit better.
Is that order
So,
correct?
huh?
Is that order correct? It's the bourbon. No, a lot of
Yeah.
people said we messed up.
Well, we missed one. So the Old Delicious is going to come after the bourbon.
Okay, that made a lot of sense. When I looked at it, I was like, we're gonna taste bourbon in apple barrels and then apple and bourbon barrels side by side.
Mm-hmm.
So make sure you save a little sip so you can side by side it.
Mm-hmm. So that's kind of that's our entry. So starting with bourbon that's finished in apple brandy barrels, then we're going to start talking about apple brandy. Like Vadim mentioned, people might be more familiar with the term Calvados. I'm not sure. Calvados is actually a regionally protected spirit. So you can make apple brandy anywhere in the world, but if you're making apple brandy in the Calvados region, which is in Normandy, the north of France, then you get to call it Calvados. Traditionally, those spirits are made with just the juice of the apples and not whole fruit. So and then also it's a combination of all different kinds of apples and sometimes also including pears. So it's kind of a mixed bag. It's up to whatever the farmer has, whatever he wants to do, whatever flavor profiles that they're trying to explore and trying to add into that brandy. Also, because France, of course, it's aged traditionally in French oak casks. Now, the cool thing about the apple varieties that they're using for Calvados is those apples tend to be like horrific. And I say horrific in that they're the bitterest crab apples. They're tart, they're too tannic. You would never ever take one in your lunchbox to eat at school. You would never ever slice one up and put it in a pie. They are specifically grown to make beautiful fermented apple ciders, and then eventually apple brandies. And what you get, even though they're so sour and they're so tart and they're so tannic, when you ferment them, you get all of these beautiful aromas, and those tannins really lean into the whole experience of the drink. So it's a lot different than what you might expect from some fermented treetop cider in your fridge, because there's so much interesting nuance to be found in blending all those varieties together and fermenting those even sometimes quite bitter apples. That bitterness really kind of finishes out a cider, and then with the distillation you get all kinds of really great nuanced esters and aromas that will translate through into the spirit. Unfortunately for us here at Clear Creek, the accessibility to horrifically bitter and tannic crab apples is really difficult here in the United States. We tend to prioritize sweetness and out of hand eating when you're talking about the apples that we are growing. And in large part, the apples that are grown en masse are what the grocery stores have decided need to be planted. So as a farmer, it's all well and good to have a bunch of trees that grow all this beautiful fruit, but if you can't sell it, then what's the point? What's all this work and effort for? And so when a big grocery store like Kroger or Safeway says, hey, we're not going to buy we're not going to buy Red Delicious apples anymore because they're garbage and nobody wants to buy them, then orchardists have nothing to do other than to chop all those down and start planting what they will buy. Which is kind of unfortunate. There's a little bit of a pinch right now on the varieties that are available because also grocery stores think that having too many varieties available is difficult for the American consumer. So where you used to see, every store might have a different set of apple varieties, and across the country we might have, you know, thousands of different apple varieties. You're starting to see less and less option at the grocery store. You might have a green one, you might have a you know, one that's green and red, and then there might be a couple kind of vanity, you know, in the moment, your cosmic crisps, those kinds of apples that you see available at the grocery store. But that's kind of it. I know you know, I'm 36, so you know, nearing middle age. But I do remember when there was a whole table of all different kinds of varieties of apples, and you just don't see that anymore. And so that's part of the pressure and the decision making for the large grocery stores. But we do what we can, and to make the best spirit as possible here in the United States, given those potential problems with what's growing. If you guys are ready to move on to the next spirit, we'll talk about Old Delicious. So now that you've had your bourbon aged in apple casks, they're actually aged in ex Old Delicious casks. Old Delicious is double bourbon barreled apple brandy. So it's the same Clear Creek apple brandy that goes into our French oak aging program, but instead of going into French oak, it goes into spent Trails End barrels. We think that bourbon is a little bit wasteful in its definition with its use of the oak barrels, with the use of its tree resources, right? Bourbon has to go into never used virgin American oak heavy char casks. And as soon as that bourbon is pulled out of that barrel, it stops aging as bourbon and they're done with that barrel. So we try to make sure that those barrels of Kentucky bourbon that we receive here in Oregon are used as much as possible. So once the Trails End bourbon has been drained from those barrels, we bring them up here to Clear Creek. We put our beautiful opal apple brandy in it. So we're using opal apples, which are fantastic. It rests in those barrels for a year. After a year, we pull that liquid out. We roll those barrels over, and they refinish on the Trails End bourbon. So that's the bourbon that you just tried. And then we bring in another set of freshly drained Trails End barrels and put that 1-year-old spirit into that next set of freshly drained bourbon barrels for a second year. So that's double bourbon barreled apple brandy. This spirit represents essentially two bridges. One bridge being that between Clear Creek Distillery and Hood River Distillers. This is the first product that we ever really worked on together as one complete company after the sale. Old Delicious is actually a revival of the first ever apple brandy brand, and I believe the first ever branded spirit that Hood River Distillers ever had, launched back in 1934. In a different packaging. It's beautiful packaging with this beveled glass, but still the old brand, and I believe they still had the trademark. So we just kind of like fished it out of the cupboard and we're like, hey, this is amazing. It's also at 85 proof for a few reasons. One, we didn't want to have to chill filter this brandy. We wanted to make sure that you were getting the full flavor of all those oils and aromas that we've worked so hard to get into the spirit in the first place. Two, Clear Creek Distillery was founded in 1985, like I said before. And also when we launched Old Delicious, it was the year of Hood River Distillers' 85th birthday. So the stars aligned and we decided to run with it. So Old Delicious is bottled at 85 proof. The other bridge that I mentioned is that it's the bridge between what Americans think the spirit of the United States is and what it actually is. In 1964, there was an act of Congress passed naming bourbon the spirit of the United States. But apple brandy was distilled in the United States by a colonist named Cornelius Towne in 1640 in present-day Staten Island, preceding the discovery of bourbon by 150 years. So several generations of colonists, of new Americans, had been distilling, imbibing, and sharing apple brandy as, you know, European colonists. They brought their technology, they brought their history, they brought their culture with them for a very long time before the Rye Revolution in Pennsylvania, and then, you know, continued movement from Pennsylvania down south to the birthplace of bourbon. So we've actually been drinking apple brandy for much, much, much longer than we've been drinking bourbon. And it's unfortunate that so much information about our spirits and about our drinking culture was lost in the seemingly 13 short years that Prohibition was around. Interestingly enough, when it comes to apple trees and apple brandies, everybody knows about Johnny Appleseed, right? He was a Swedenborgian minister. They didn't believe in doing any tree grafting because they believed that by cutting the tree and trying to graft it onto a rootstock, you're causing harm and pain to that living thing. And so he planted all of those trees from seeds. Now, when you plant trees from seeds, you get a great deal of genetic diversity because it's not the same tree. Like we're used to all of our orchards being literally genetically identical trees to create exactly identical fruit. Instead, it's all different kinds of gene expressions, all different kind of flavors. If you were able to take the seeds from a grocery store apple and plant them, you would probably get something more closely related to a crab apple than the apple that it came from. It would probably be a little bit more like those tart and tannic apples that I was talking about, because that's essentially where all apples came from in the first place. And so he went through, and as a part of pushing the western frontier of the United States, rules as far as being able to establish yourself on property, you had to have, in homesteading, you had to have so many trees, you had to be able to grow so much food. And so he went around planting all these trees. And in Prohibition, they cut them all down. And the reason was is Johnny Appleseed wasn't planting trees so that you can make apple pies and make dried apple rings. He was planting trees so you can make apple cider and then eventually distill it into apple brandy. And so the Prohibitionists looked at all of these, thousands of acres of apples across the Northeast, all the way through to Ohio, and said, hey, then our trees make sin juice. We're going to chop them all down. And so there's only one of Johnny Appleseed's trees left, and I think it's Nova, Ohio. And it's not doing well, although scientists and research, interestingly enough, with Johnny Appleseed being against grafting, scientists and researchers are trying to take clippings of that tree so that it can be grafted and therefore saved. So I don't know if that necessarily is what he would prefer, but it is a really interesting and I think special kind of piece of history of the colonization and pushing through the western frontier, and really a part of our alcoholic culture as well. So the Old Delicious kind of represents a whole lot of things in being this bridge between what Americans think the spirit of the United States is and what it really is, which is that apple brandy. I'm going to check the chat here and see if there's any more questions. Oh, so Applejack, the difference between apple brandy and Applejack. Applejack, I don't remember what the percentages are, but Applejack usually denotes that there is some grain spirit that's blended in with it. The original term of Applejack or jacking a spirit was essentially freeze distillation, which I don't suggest you try. It's certainly a technology of its time where you would make an apple cider, let it outside freeze. When water freezes, it's exclusionary. So water will freeze and snap into a crystalline form only with water. And so it pushes everything out. So you could freeze it, pull out this core of ice, and then it's concentrated everything else. So you're increasing the proof of that cider and all that stuff. The problem with that being a good idea is that there's all kinds of things like the stuff that we are excluding in the distillation process, the heads and tails. When you're just doing freeze distillation, all that stuff is still in there. So you're just removing the water and concentrating everything out. So you can actually do yourself a little bit of harm if you do freeze distillation, which is why we don't do freeze distillation. It's fun when you're a kid and you do freeze distillation of like Kool-Aid, because then you make like super liquid sugary Kool-Aid, but don't do it with spirits. It's a bad idea. Let's see.
I'm assuming the Trails End is also non-chill filtered. I got some flocculation on the bottle when I was pouring it. I mean, it's gone now, but I have a clear photo of.
Yep. No, none of the Trails End products are chill filtered. Flock is just kind of, it's more common in bourbon than a lot of other things. It's totally harmless. It's a bunch of fatty acids and stuff. So it's essentially flavor that's bumped into each other enough times to kind of hang out in a bar together. And then so you can actually kind of see these like wispy flakes in the bottle. And
Are you talking about us or I feel like I feel seen right now.
sure,
Fatty
sure.
acids hang out enough and just hang out
Uh-huh.
in the bar. Yeah.
It's all the good stuff. It's all the flavor. If we filtered it out, it just wouldn't be anywhere near as fun.
Again, I feel seen.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. All right. So it looks like we've all had the old delicious apple brandy. I don't see any more questions in the chat about it.
I did.
So
So you said this is essentially apple cider distilled, like
no, so in Calvados is apple cider distilled. They will juice the apples, ferment it, and then distill it. I forgot the rest of that sentence. Thank you for reminding me. Here at Clear Creek Distillery, we're actually doing whole fruit fermentation. So for all of our brandies, we are crushing, fermenting, and distilling on the whole fruit. So when it comes time for apple crush or apple brandy season, which is just around the corner, I can't believe it. We're actually getting in, 58,000 pounds of apples at a time. And unlike pears, we don't have to ripen those in the distillery, so we're able to crush them literally the next day, which is nice. We only have one day where we have absolutely no floor space with all that fruit in the building, and then we whisk it away into the fermentation tanks. With the apples, they're coming out of cold storage. So with pears, we're ripening them, which means that we're also warming them up. Apples coming straight from cold storage and then being fermented. It takes a couple days for them to actually warm up in the tank and then for the fermentation to really take off. So that's kind of like a fun side note. But all of our apple brandy is made with whole apples. Originally, Steve started with Golden Delicious apples. They were the place where flavor, fermentability, availability, and price all came together on the Golden Delicious variety. It tends to not be eaten out of hand because it has a little bit of a mealy texture, but it has a really good flavor and it has lots of sugar in it. And it was grown at the time in abundance. So it was really easy to get, 250,000 pounds of those apples every year to turn into apple brandy. But like I said, with pressure from the grocery stores and the juice companies, we're moving on to other varieties as well. There was really no market for those apples anymore, and so we switched 4, maybe 5 years ago now, to opal apples. And we find that while it's a very similar flavor, it's actually, you're getting a little bit more of those fruity floral notes. So I don't want to say better, but like it's a slightly better, more aromatic spirit, which is great. And the yield is actually a little bit better. And as far as handling the mashing and fermenting, it still breaks down readily in the fermenters. So it was, from my perspective, a total improvement across the board, which is always nice. It sucks when you have to change varieties and you have to decide which of those columns you have to take a loss in. It was great that we could tick boxes across the board as a win in switching to that new variety. So the 2-year that releases this year and the Old Delicious in the next couple of years, that will all be opal apples, but it'll take a little bit of time for the 8-year apple brandy, which we'll try coming up soon, for that to be that new variety. So I think actually everything that I sent you is still the Golden Delicious apples.
Cool. Thank you.
All right. Oh, is this a good time? I just saw you threw the Instagram up. When do you want me to talk about the pear butt competition? You mentioned it previously that you wanted that on the recording.
You can talk about it whenever you want.
I guess we are transitioning now to like Clear Creek Distillery products. So here at this facility, we actually churn out 29 different liquid items. Not all of those liquid items are specifically Clear Creek branded items. I describe the relationship with all of the brands, Clear Creek and also the mothership, Hood River Distillers, by using the solar system. So Hood River Distillers being the sun, Clear Creek is Saturn because it's the dopest planet. And we also make, like Vadim said earlier, the McCarthy's American Single Malt, which is increasingly being treated a little bit more of an independent brand. The story of McCarthy's and Clear Creek, it's really important that they always stay intertwined because we were and are still one company, but it is an odd man out when we make a bunch of fruit brandies and fruit liqueurs. And then, oh, by the way, also the first American single malt. So McCarthy's kind of lives its own kind of separate brand story. So I kind of use the rings of Saturn to describe McCarthy's. But around Saturn are all these other moons. And so that, in my mind, represent all of these independent brands, things made by Clear Creek Distillery, made by the team here, but are not, or at least are loosely affiliated with Clear Creek Distillery. So Old Delicious, Trails End, those are things that would be considered moons, but still come out of this facility, still made by the team here. By the way, I would love to give a shout out to my two distillers, Garrett Trotter and Everett Rubin. Garrett Trotter's been with us for almost 2 years, and Everett started this fall. They're an amazing team. They're the reason that I get to do all these fun things like tastings with you guys. The three of us process over 1 million pounds of Pacific Northwest fruit into fruit brandies and fruit liqueurs. And then that's not to mention all the other independent brands that we make as well, a couple vodkas and the like. So we're a small team, but we're an awesome team, and I just want to make sure that they get the credit for all of the hard work that they do as well. It's not a woman show. It's a team. We're always a team. So now we're moving to Clear Creek Distillery items, and since we're talking about Clear Creek Distillery, our highest, or the Instagram post that we have every year that has the highest interest routinely is the pear butt contest. So I don't know how many of you were on my first tasting with Virtual Tasting Society, where we got to taste the pear brandy. It takes 20 pounds of pears to make our pear brandy. It's a lot of pears. We process over 500,000 pounds of pears every year into that brandy. And that means we're doing several crushes throughout the fall and winter. And every time we find a pear that has a really nice derriere, we take a photo of it because it's funny. And at the end of the day, you're never really not a child. We can pretend to be adults, but I think we could all agree that we hope we never lose a little bit of our childish wonder and our joy for the silly and the outrageous. And then we put them up in a post where the public gets to vote on which one is the best one of the season. So I feel like we have some pretty good ones in there. Oh, Diana is showing one on her camera. Yeah, no, it's a lot of fun. It's going well. I run the Instagram accounts for both for Clear Creek Distillery, McCarthy's, and Trails End. And so when I posted the competition this morning, my phone, it's like, whoa, it's a wild ride with all the different notifications and stuff like it. So I look forward to the pear butt contest as much, I think, as everybody else does. I'm not entirely sure my C-suite is super on board with it, but numbers are numbers, and give the people what they want, and the people need a little bit of silliness. So there you go, pear butt contest. So let's try our first Clear Creek branded apple brandy. We're going to start with the 2-year apple brandy. So we did actually have a new packaging launch, kind of the late fall. So gone are the like clunky apple bottles and the tall, thin brandy bottles. Now everything that you see that's Clear Creek will be in this same round bottle. And the 750 size is changed to a 700 milliliter size. Mostly so that we can export, because I don't know if you guys were aware of this, but the EU has separate regulations for the size of bottles that they're willing to accept. And the US has a separate rules on what size bottles they're willing to accept. And the EU, their full size bottle is 700, where ours are 750. Which means that if you were a United States producer and you wanted to export any of your products, you had to maintain 2 separate packaging lines and 2 separate inventories of dry goods in order to bottle things that were going to be stateside, and then also bottle things that you were going to export. And so by switching to the 700s as the total size, with the change from the TTB to accept that size now in the United States, we're now able to have 1 set of inventory for our product instead of 2, and then readily are able to export that around the world. So that's the reason for the change, if anybody was wondering. The 2-year apple, like I said, with all the Clear Creek products, with all the Clear Creek apple brandies, it's aged in limousine French oak casks. So they're 350-liter beautiful French oak casks, both used and new cooperage. With the 2-year, the story behind the 2-year, Steve was never planning on releasing something this young. He always had his sights set on the 8-year apple brandy, with that much more rich baking spice character that one would expect from the French oak. But you always want to make sure that you're listening to your customers. And a lot of our customers, especially in the early days, were chefs and gourmands. And they were coming to the distillery and being like, hey, your apple brandy is great and stuff, but it would be really awesome if you had something that was a little bit younger and a little bit fresher so that we could cook with it. So we could deglaze our pans and baste our duck with it and all those kinds of beautiful, wonderful things. And so that was actually the impetus behind the 2-year. It was really never meant to be sipped, quaffed, or cocktailed. It was specifically spun out as a cooking and baking apple brandy. And so I think it really speaks to the quality of the liquid in the bottle that all these years later, it is consumed so much across the country, both neat and in cocktails. And I think it's a little bit sad that it's been brandies have been kind of forgotten as a culinary ingredient. But the fact that our 2-year is good enough to sit in a glass with an ice cube, that means the world to me. So I think you'll find it does have a little bit of that fresh bite of a crisp apple, some of those kind of high notes of a young spirit, but also of a really rich apple spirit as well. And those spice characteristics of the French oak are kind of like putting salt on a potato. Like a potato doesn't really taste like a potato until you put a little bit of salt on it. Apple brandy doesn't really taste like apple brandy until you've put a little bit of age on it and let some of those like vanillins and things like, the nuttiness and the clove that come out of an oak barrel to really kind of season that brandy and bring the apple to life on your palate.
I kind of grew up with a lot of different types of weird fruit brandies because I had some vaguely German ancestors along with the Irish ones, and they were always doing something weird in the shed that Grandma didn't want to talk about. But this reminds me a lot of something that one of my great uncles used to make. It's just, I mean, we were the ones out there like squashing all the apples with the hand crank press, so we were all too young to drink it when it was done. But this is just delicious.
That's kind of the cool like history and heritage of fruit brandies, of brandies. Like it takes an awful lot of grain to make one bottle of whiskey, and grain makes bread, and grain makes beer, and grain rules the world, right? But you can make an awful lot of brandy from one mangy fruit tree in your grandmother's backyard. Like I don't know if anybody's ever experienced the proliferation of a plum tree, but you've turned it into wine, and you've turned it into pies, and you've dried it, and you've canned it, and you've jarred it, and you've given it away to all your neighbors, whether they want you to or not. And you still have plums coming out of your ears. So the last thing that you would do to preserve that harvest would be to ferment and then distill it. It's the last thing that you do to save those calories. And so brandy isn't this like weird highfalutin spirit that Americans seem to have it categorized away in dusty bottles and grandma's shelves. It really has these beautiful agrarian roots. It was the last thing that you did. It was the end of the harvest celebration was to ferment that and to distill it into brandy. So it's not a scary word. It's not a scary category. It's something really, really beautiful and a great expression of the area that you live in. If you're talking about buying a local brandy, like that's awesome. So we're going to move next to the 8-year apple. So we're just kind of going to be slowly increasing in age. Same delicious whole fruit brandy. Same Clear Creek stills are 60-gallon Arnold Holstein combination pot stills or hybrid pot stills. So it's a pot still with a short column, all made of copper. the big difference here is going to be just time in those French oak barrels. So as much as Vadim said earlier, a masterclass in apple brandy, which I'm always going to shy away from anything that I have to say being a masterclass. I will say that it is going to be a masterclass in tasting the effects that a French oak cask, and a beautiful one at that, has on essentially the same substrate, that apple brandy, and how much it really changes over time.
When you keep saying whole apple, whole fruit distilling, can you actually explain the process? I'm just trying to wrap my head around it. Like
Yeah, absolutely.
you're not using juice, but you're using the pulp. I mean, are you guys putting in a big crusher, or are you guys
So
stomping?
we've had there sometimes they're called hammer mills, although I don't think that's really fair. We've had a few pieces of equipment to process apples over the year. We had one for the longest time. It was called Telma. Telma was her name because it was the brand name, and it was emblazoned across the front of this piece of equipment. So I just called it Telma because that's what you do. Telma almost killed my predecessor Joseph in a meltdown. Telma almost killed me, probably 10 years later, and when she had a meltdown. Both Joseph and I were kind of the handy persons of our respective crews. He worked at Clear Creek Distillery from 2005 to 2009. I started in 2010 essentially as his replacement, as a person that knew what wrenches were and which direction to turn them. And so I inherited a lot of things that gave him grief. I then inherited, and then they gave me grief. And then when he returned to the brand in 2017, we had kind of all of these stories to share in his early times in dealing with them, and then the 7 years that I had been dealing with them and keeping them running. When it broke down on Joseph, or I should explain it. So Telma is the same as essentially the other two pieces of equipment that we've used, and that it's a giant industrial blender, for lack of a better term. Stands about 5 feet tall, has this big funnel and collar on it, and then inside were all of these whirring blades. So Telma, the OG, it essentially had two massive steel knives that were like opposite each other, like this, and they would spin and slice the apples into smaller chunks, but still big chunks. And then underneath were these like super scary round blades, and the teeth were alternated. So up, down, up, down, up, down. And that would grind those then like chunks into smaller pieces and then rocket them out the bottom into a separate pump. And we could process, 58,000 pounds in a day that way. There was no safety on this piece of equipment. It was 1,000,000 years old, and it just had this massive electric motor underneath it that made those blades spin. So when Joseph nearly died, it was because a metal corner of one of the fruit bins managed to fall in, and they didn't get it turned off in time. And so the metal hit all those spinning blades and started shooting off little stainless steel teeth out of the opening of Telma. So he made a necklace out of one of the teeth, kind of like a shark tooth necklace, because why not? And then when it imploded on me, it was those two stainless knives on the top, and one of the stainless knives just broke off, and it nearly came through like the casing, like it actually cracked the casing on the outside of the piece of equipment, and it would have gone, I don't know how fast that blade was going, but my leg was just on the other side of that. So big ouchie. Telma died 8-9 years ago now. I think HRD had only owned us for about a year before Telma finally died. And then we got a new one. And that one, unfortunately, goes the way of many of the equipment that we've bought over the years, and that we're heavily dependent on European equipment, because what we're doing is making essentially European fruit brandies. And that one was an Italian piece of equipment with a German motor, electric motor running on American current. So that one only lasted 4 or 5 years. And then this new one doesn't have any blades at all, which is great. But it is actually a high-speed apple grater. So the whole apples go in. It's the same setup, like hopper, collar, and then there's this high-speed spinning angle iron that pushes the whole apples against a semicircle of grater, just like your home grater. And then in 8 hours, we can turn 58,000 pounds into grated whole apples. that then get pumped into the tanks. And the tanks hold about 1,500 gallons of I'll say material, because it's not juice. It's the skins, the seeds, the juice, everything gets pumped into those tanks. And then we're all we're doing is adding yeast. And then once a day, they get mixed up with a big punch to make sure that we're mixing oxygen into those fermentations. We're regulating the temperature of the cap. If the cap overheats, the whole fermentation overheats. The yeast get stressed. They start making weird smells, and then it could eventually die. And that is also another weird smell, and that's bad. And then you also want to make sure that your fermentation, all that alcohol, has access to all those leftover sugars and oils and stuff that are in that cap as well. So that's kind of the nuts and bolts of what an apple crush and apple fermentation looks like. Back in the day with Telma, she didn't have any guards on her, which is why the teeth could just come flailing out of there. And which meant that we were also wearing rain gear, because you would be absolutely dripping wet with apple juice all day long, as spray of apple juice would come out of that equipment. And the last two pieces of equipment that we've purchased, they've had some guards on the top, so you don't get constantly battered with teeny tiny pieces of apple and apple juice all day long. So as a person that had, for the last 13 years, and this will be the first year that I'm not on a ladder, which I've been thoroughly enjoying, it was a nice change to just be able to wear regular clothes and maybe a light sweater instead of being kitted out in like Gordon's fisherman rain gear in order to make it through your day, and just be like, just every exposed piece of your body is just sticky.
So essentially, you're making applesauce and then just fermenting it.
Yeah, really chunky applesauce.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
What's left when you finish the distillation? Do you have like the pasty gunk that you end up doing something else with, or is it just trashed at that point?
Well, that's kind of the cool thing about what we're doing. By the time we have mashed up all of this fruit and then fermented it and then distilled it, we've consumed most, if not all, of the sugar. We've then removed most, if not all, of the ethanol, including a bunch of the oils, and because that's what all the flavor is going to be oils and aromas from that fruit. So what's left is like a slightly acidic, sterile water and cellulose. So someday I hope to get to the size that, one, we outgrow this building, which we are nearing. And then in the next facility that Clear Creek hopefully continues to live on in, will be set up in a way where we can actually reclaim that and then send it off to be composted. But for the time being, even though 1 million pounds of fruit sounds like a really big number, it's actually super not. And so for the time being, it makes more sense from the amount of people that work here and the equipment and the way this building was set up to unfortunately not compost that. But hopefully that's something that we can see through someday.
That's cool.
The biggest problem is that, like, when it comes out of the stills, it's essentially napalm. And so finding equipment in a safe way, equipment that can, and in a safe way, handle that material in large volumes. We're kind of in an awkward size where if we were smaller, we'd be able to do it. And if we were much bigger, we'd be able to do it. But we're kind of in that weird middle phase where there's not equipment that's scaled appropriately for where we are. So we just kind of make do until we get big enough to get that equipment.
Thanks. That makes so much more sense. I was like, what on earth could possibly be left?
Yeah, no, it's not much. It's not much. And like from a wastewater treatment perspective, it's sterile. So we're not adding, and we've removed all the alcohol. So we're not adding anything of note into the wastewater treatment stream either. So that's kind of nice.
It just sounds like fun though. I watch things get squashed and turned into brandy.
Oh no, absolutely. I will say, like, it's totally entertaining for like the first 4 years. I know, like, my first crush season, my first pear crush season here at the distillery. There's so many interesting things to experience that one might not expect in starting a career in a distillery. The first one that I like to laugh about is just spraying a water hose inside a building, right? Like, can you imagine like when you were a kid and you were having a water fight and you ran into the house with the hose and the sprayer end to continue your water fight? Like instant death from your parental units, right? No way, no how. And so like day one at a distillery, they're like, hey, clean this thing out. And you're like, I am inside and this is a spray hose. This feels like it's going to get me into trouble. So that's the first one. And the second one is just like essentially the wanton destruction of food. So that all of the fruit that we're buying, it's ugly fruit. So with the pears and apples, it's stuff that is not likely to see the grocery store shelf because the fruit is too big, the fruit is too small, and maybe it has a scar on it from a branch whacking it around all summer long. Maybe it has a little bit of a sunburn on one cheek because it was towards the edge of the tree. All of those things factor into the likelihood that piece of fruit is going to be picked up by a consumer in a grocery store. Now, ugly fruit will tell you that the rest of that food has gone to waste all these years. And I will tell you that, while Americans definitely have a food waste problem, it hasn't been going to waste all these years because we have all these wonderful processed foods that need ingredients for. So all this ugly fruit gets turned into juices, gets turned into brandy, and is used for all different reasons and as all different kinds of ingredients. So with like the pear buds, you're not likely to see Bartlett pears with bodacious butts in your grocery store because those are sorted out in sorting facilities for being weirdly shaped because everybody expects their Bartlett pear or their apple to be a certain shape and a certain color. And so those are deemed unacceptable, which is why we have quite a few of them after we process all those pears because we have all the ugly fruit. So same goes with apples. We're processing all of the ugly fruit into our apple brandy. Bodacious budded Bartlett pears. Well done. I don't know who did that, but well done. So what do we think of the 8-year apple brandy? Anybody want to chime in?
It's fantastic. You could definitely tell it's the older, more mature version of the 2-year. The 2-year is vibrant, but a little lighter. And this has definitely got more depth to it. It's so delicious.
What the trade-off is in that aging period is where the 2-year, you got a lot of that like crisp, fresh bite of an apple. With the 8-year, you're trading that crispness for that more baked apple pie characteristic. So that high note, that edge there is gone, but there's a richness that lies underneath that.
Kind of like the batch of apple butter that I forgot to put the spices in.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah. It's really interesting because they're obviously the same sort of thing in the glass, but the crispy fresh apple versus this has had a chance to sit and kind of chill out. That 8 is just spectacular. It's so lovely.
Mm-hmm.
Very excited about this.
Well, in a virtual tasting society exclusive, the next thing that we're tasting isn't actually bottled or a product yet. I hope that it sees store shelves sometime this year. I haven't harvested these barrels, but we've been working on it for a bit, and we do have label approval for it, which is amazing. But this will be a blend of 12 and 13-year-old apple brandies bottled at 94 proof. So we did a small bench trial of what that will taste like. And then sent that to the dean to be split up amongst all of you. So you are the first people outside of essentially me, because I made that I did the bench trials this summer. So not even Everett or Garrett has tried them. But you guys are the first people to get a chance to taste this new reserve blend from Clear Creek Distillery.
I will say that the labeling and bottling on these is my favorite when I get these from brands.
So actually, I do have it. Well, you guys have an opportunity to taste that. I have a fun because, of course, I have a fun story. I have a fun story about why we have those bottles. So, like I said, we're owned by Hood River Distillers. Hood River Distillers has like 60 or 80 different liquid items that they handle on top of our like 29. So really between everything that the Hood River Distillers owns and makes, Clear Creek Distillery, and then also our sister distillery up in Seattle, Captive Spirits, we can essentially equip a craft cocktail bar with literally everything that they need without getting outside of things that we actually make, which is kind of crazy. And so we run the gamut from value brands all the way to premium, and pretty much every category in between. And so those pint plastic bottles are a packaging that we use for some of the value branded items down at Hood River Distillers. And there was a trailer load that got damaged by heat. I think it was because of the heat dome. They were in transit when it was 120 degrees here in Oregon for 2 days, and the shape was changed just ever so much that they wouldn't run efficiently on our high-speed bottling lines. So they were warped just enough that they would get stuck and then get ejected from the system. And so we're like, I don't know what we're going to do with these bottles. So they sat in a trailer for over a year, or maybe it was a couple of years. Anyways, 2020 happens. The beginning of the pandemic, we get released from the TTB to make hand sanitizer as a part of our distillery license. And so we start turning out thousands of gallons of hand sanitizer. And the leadership team was like, okay, well, we have this liquid now. What packaging are we going to get this in? What can we do? And I was like, hey, remember how we have that whole trailer of plastic pints? And so they brought one pallet up here for us to use as sample bottles, and the rest of that entire trailer load got bottled into hand sanitizer because we had nothing else to do. So they were able to run the bottling line really slow so that we were able to handle all the small defects in those bottles, because we were hand labeling them anyways, because we were literally printing the labels out on printer paper, because there was no way we could get something printed out in an actual printer in time, especially with so many companies laying off workforces. So those to me, while they look goofy, are a remembrance of the privilege that it was to have purpose during the early days of the pandemic, when we really weren't sure what was going to happen and what was going to happen to not only ourselves, our families, and our jobs, but also our industry. So kind of weird to be nostalgic about a plastic bottle, but I'm 100% nostalgic about a plastic bottle.
You should totally be nostalgic about a plastic bottle. That's so cool.
We actually made 22,000 gallons of hand sanitizer in March, April, and May of 2020.
Wow.
It was a very interesting time in my career, for sure.
Yeah, and I spent the next year and a half using it all up on shows. So.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I still have it. We saved a few cases here at the distillery. It was really good stuff. So I have one that I keep in my car.
That's awesome.
What were these? Was it out of fruit, or what was it?
So that is another, of the many benefits of being a part of Hood River Distillers. Hood River Distillers actually owns a rail spur. So a lot of the post-prohibition or pre-prohibition, their business style would be called a rectifier. So Hood River Distillers, like I said earlier, founded in 1934 by three friends that had moved to the Hood River Valley from the East Coast, and were like, hey, there's a lot of apples and pears here. We should ferment and distill those. Wouldn't that be neat? During a brief time during World War II, the United States government asked anybody that was able to make alcohol, would they please make industrial alcohol for the war effort in order to manufacture rubber and explosives? And Hood River Distillers happily obliged. And then getting out of the war, Americans were not consuming brandy like they were. That spirit style had fallen out of favor for clear spirits like gin and vodka. And then Hood River Distillers sold to the current owning families. There's three families, with the majority stakeholders being the Dodge family, who still own it to this day. And then in the mid 50s, they quit fermenting and distilling. And like I said, changed to be more of what would have been called a rectifier, in that they've been buying bulk spirits and then blending them together into new products and creating brands and selling those across the country. So they have a rail spur, which is rad. And they also had received a delivery of a rail car of grain neutral spirits from the Midwest right before the whole world shut down. And so we weren't sure if we were going to be producing anything. They weren't sure if they were going to be able to bottle and sell anything. And so when we were we were released by the TTB to make that hand sanitizer, we had 36,000 gallons of 192 proof grain neutral spirit, just like sitting out back with nothing to do. So I think probably fairly rare for distilleries. We were making it from a neutral spirit. So there was a lot of hand sanitizers out there that smelled and tasted like tequila. And there was a lot of, kind of raw new make whiskey hand sanitizers. And ours actually had like no smell. And then the other important note is that we contracted, we briefly sold to local government agencies for emergency services. And then we contracted with Moda Health, which is one of the large health care providers here in the Pacific Northwest. And so we sold it all at cost to Moda Health so that we could preserve the retail market of hand sanitizer for our smaller craft distilleries, so that they could continue to sell that and still have some revenue during those early months of the pandemic, because we were in the position where we could do that. So it was a really cool project to be a part of. So now that we've talked about hand sanitizer, which I didn't expect to come up today, right, so a blend of 12 and 13-year apple brandies. Again, we're just kind of slowly marching through time to see the effects of a quality French oak cask on a beautiful apple brandy. Interesting facts about French oak. It is a hardwood, but the nature of the way that it grows means that it can't be sawn into staves. It has to be naturally broken into those staves. So where American white oak is much more durable oak. So it's quarter sawn. You're able to get more staves out of any specific chunk of American white oak. For both Oregon oak and French oak, you have to break those staves along the kind of natural growing lines, and then shape those staves from those pieces. And so you're not able to get as many staves out of any individual piece of wood. Also, a similarity that both Oregon oak and French oak share are what's called soft tyloses. So when a tree is growing, the outside edge of that wood is the only growing and green layer of that tree. It's made of what's called xylem and phloem, which are essentially these living straws that transport water and nutrients from the ground up to the leaves and energy from the leaves down into the roots. And now as the tree grows, it creates more and more of that living wood, and on the inside, the living wood turns to dead wood, and that becomes structure for the tree. That's what literally holds the tree up. So only the outside of the tree is really alive. The inside is dead, but is the structure. And for oak species, they install on certain segments of these straws once it dies, tyloses, so that you don't get any more liquid transfer through all these straws. Makes it a hardwood, makes it really tough and durable. For American oak, those are hard tyloses. So even if you are properly seasoning those staves out in the open air for 2-3 years, those tyloses stay intact. You're only going to get spirit pushing into the grain of the wood so far, because when it hits those tyloses, it's not going to go any further. Now with Oregon oak and French oak, those are soft tyloses, which means over the 24-36 months of air drying in stacks in the out of doors, you're not only leaching away some of the more harsh tannins that those woods would give, which would be kind of weird flavors if it wasn't properly cured wood to make those barrels, but you also get a deeper penetration of that spirit through the wood grain. So you have access to even more flavor, even more of those extractives that wood has to offer. And French oak in particular is known for having a lot of vanillins and then a great deal of those baking spices. So things like cinnamon and clove, nutmeg, a little bit of almond, things that remind us of apple pies and rich baked goods. And so as we've kind of been marching through these years of apple brandy, there's little bits of vanilla and caramel that you were maybe picking up in the 2-year, and then you start getting a little bit of those baking spices when you get into the 8. Now that you're into the blend, that richness, that unctuousness from the barrel is starting to come through. And I also sent Vadim a sample of some 15-year-old apple brandy for you guys to try. There was only 4 of these barrels. As much as I love it, they do represent a little bit of an accident in that when it comes to like older releases of spirits, some people are like, oh, wow, this is amazing. The distillery held on to this spirit for 20 years just so that we could taste what a 20-year-old bourbon or a 20-year-old brandy tastes like. Where I think maybe most commonly from the distilling side, that essentially represents years and years and years of failure, that we weren't able to sell it at 18. We weren't able to sell it at 12. We weren't able to sell it at 8 or 2. So these 4 barrels, they managed to slip the net on 8-year sales. And then because we don't sell anything older than 8-year, every time we were going through the barrel room to look for new barrels that were of age for 2 or 8-year-old brandy, these ones were forgotten. They didn't populate in that search. And it wasn't until about 3 years ago that we discovered that they even existed. And we were like, holy cow, how did we not notice we've got 12-year apple brandy? And now we have 4 barrels of 15-year-old apple brandy. We sold them all as individual single barrels at cask strength this year, and I sent you guys a sample of them. In the notes that I sent Vadim for this, there is a link both to our website where you can now purchase bottles. So for the first time for the Virtual Tasting Society, we actually have worked with Big Thirst to be able to have online direct-to-consumer shipping of our spirits. So huzzah! But also there was a separate link for where one of the single barrels of 15-year-old apple brandy is, and I think there's still a few bottles left. So that single barrel went for sale in November, and these are fairly large barrels, so there was quite a few cases to get out of a single barrel. So if you do like it, you do potentially have the opportunity to buy it. It's pretty reasonably priced. I think it's like $109 a bottle or something like that. So for a 15-year-old apple brandy, pretty spectacular. And if any of you guys are in Oregon, we also kept 1 single barrel to split between our 2 tasting rooms, 1 in Portland and then 1 here in Hood River. So you can get access to it that way as well.
So as we pour our last dram of the night, this delicious single barrel cask strength apple brandy at 15 years old, oof, not a mouthful at all, I invite everyone to turn on their camera and join us. Rory, there you go. Alana, you gonna join us? There we go. Yeah. All right. I invite everyone to join us on their camera and raise a glass to Caitlin for constantly coming back and teaching us more stuff, great stuff with us. So
constantly, it makes me sound like a nuisance.
No. You coming back and enjoying the evenings with us. To many more. Cheers.
Cheers.
Perfect.
Actually, and I've been really terrible about this, about not taking selfies for these, so that I can also have a post afterwards. So I'm going to do one of these awkward office selfies. Cheers.
All right. So what do people think of this 15-year-old apple brandy? I've noticed that. So when you put 8 years old on the barrel, is it the same rules as whiskey? The youngest drop in the bottle is 8 years old?
Yeah. Absolutely.
Is that a
it's not like
law,
so with bourbon, it stops aging once you remove it from its cask. With everything else, it can go from barrel to barrel to barrel, and it continues on adding to that age. So for an example, if you had a 2-year-old bourbon and you pull it out of its original cask and then you put it in another barrel for 30 years, it would be a 2-year-old bourbon finished for 30 years in whatever barrel that was. So bourbon stops aging once it leaves its first cask. But yeah, for everything else, it's as old as the youngest drop in that blend.
Is that a brandy law, or is that just something you guys have adapted?
No, that's a spirits rule.
Okay, because I know I don't think that's the case with like rum.
In the States, I would say it probably is. Well, and that's the other thing. So if you don't put an age statement on it, then nobody cares.
That's true.
So if you say it's a 2-year-old rum, then every drop of it has to be at least 2 years old. Now, it could be, you could put 3 drops of 2-year-old in there, and it could be 12 barrels of 15-year in there, and you still meet the minimum of 2 years. And because you had those 3 drops in there, it would then be considered a 2-year-old rum. But if you're not calling out the age statement, then your blend gets to be based on the flavor profile that you're looking for. And you might be looking for something that has some characteristics of a new make spirit or a barely aged spirit, as well as some of the things that you might be getting from a really, really old spirit. That's one of the kind of the cool things about Canadian whiskey is they generally don't put age statements on things, or at least they do. I think they do increasingly now because American consumers are kind of used to that. But traditionally, it would just be, you know, blended Canadian, and it would just be made of really super good stuff. And actually, for a great example, our Oregon brandy, it says it's 2 years old, but generally speaking, the brandy that goes in there is between 4 and 7 years old. So we, for whatever reason, that label decided to make a minimum of 2 years old, but.
And the 40% on the 2 and the 8, is that just classic Calvados
Yep.
style?
Oh, I don't actually know what the like classic Calvados proof would be. Those were definitely your standard like high proof spirit proof, right? So we're as American consumers, that everything was 80 proof or it was a cordial, so it was like, you know, 20, 30, 40 proof. And so it's really been in the last 10 years or so that outside of something that's like a single barrel or a Navy strength that we're seeing these higher proofs of things.
I love the new packaging, by the way. It's beautiful.
Oh, I'm glad you like it. It's always a little bit hard to say goodbye to things. You know, we said goodbye to the old labels in 2015, but we kept a lot of the original bottles. And so now this is new labels and new bottles. So I am a little bit sad that we're moving away from that tall fluted glass for the brandies, but I think liquor store owners and consumers are probably going to celebrate because that tall bottle doesn't fit on any shelf. Any shelf ever. So even though we're priced eye level in a liquor store, all of our brandies are always on the top shelf because that's the only place those bottles fit. So I think that's been a little frustrating over the years. And same thing with bars and restaurants. We would love to see our bottle on, you know, proudly displayed on the back bar, but those have shelves and our bottle is too tall. So it has to be buried kind of behind the well, which is unfortunate.
You have any good cocktail recipes or recipes of other kind that
Oh gosh. I mean, they're like all the classics with apple brandies. I'm a terrible bartender. You know, my go-to vodka cocktail is the Timberline vodka with a pickle in it. It's delicious. You should try it. I made what I've been calling a lazy old fashioned with the Trail's End maybe 2 months ago, where it was Trail's End, the DeGroff aperitivo, which we also make here at Clear Creek, and a little bit of pancake syrup. So aperitivos are traditionally made with a great deal of orange. So you had your orange, your citrus component, a little bit of sugar. Totally lazy, totally works. Gosh, with the apple brandies, I mean, I actually cook of all of them. I love the Old Delicious neat, and certainly the 15 year is such a treat. But I cook a lot with the 2 year. I sub out a lot of recipes that will call for bourbon. I'll put the 2 year in. There's actually this really wonderful spiced pork tenderloin recipe that I use that was supposed to be a bourbon in it, but fruit and pork play so well together that I've been putting apple brandy in it for years. It's one of those, while I don't have in-laws and I'm not dating anybody, I always kind of slotted it for like a showstopper if I ever were to have in-laws, because it's really good. And especially with that apple brandy, it's like, okay, if I'm going to have to be a Stepford wife and pull out my proper serving, platters and everything and put on a real showstopper meal, it's going to be that apple brandy based spiced pork tenderloin. So yeah, I cook with the 2 year a lot. I put it in my pie crusts. But yeah, I'm such a purist, and we work so hard for that neat pour. I don't do a lot of mixing with the apple brandies. I just enjoy them.
I feel like that 8 year would be great in like a hot toddy in this weather.
Mm-hmm.
Just give it a splash of apple.
You said you put it in your pie crust? Tell me.
Mm-hmm. So pie crusts are a lot of people don't want to make them because making pastry is a nightmare. But the cool thing is science. So water mixed with flour creates gluten, right? You're hydrating that protein, and the more you work it, the stretchier and the harder it gets, which is why pie crust is so frustrating, because you just need to add just enough water for it to come together, and you don't want to hardly work it at all, because you want it to be nice and flaky, and you don't want it to and tender, and you don't want it to be tough and crackery. But it's really hard to get it to come together and to roll out and to be able to like do nice things with it if you don't have enough moisture. And so it cracks, it crumbles, it's frustrating. Who gets that kind of time? You buy your crust from the grocery store. I can't blame anybody. I grew up a farmer in the middle of nowhere. I had an interesting growing up experience. I don't think my parents intended on raising me without a gender, but they kind of accidentally did. I would spend all day working out in the field with my dad, wrenching on equipment and, driving combines and all that kind of stuff. And then I would come home and help mom with dinner and do all the dishes. So I kind of, and if you're going to talk about traditional gender roles in an old farm family, in a farmhouse, I did both always. And so I was like, okay, well, if I'm going to be a fully grown adult woman, I need to have these like weird farm lady cooking skills. And so in like high school, I was like, I have to master pie because that's how I'll get a husband. I have to make good pie. I don't know. Teenagers were weird. So I got really into pastry and making pies for a period of time. And it would always make me so mad that pie crust was so difficult. Now, the cool thing about spirits is that they're made from ethanol, and ethanol doesn't hydrate gluten. So you can use a little bit of ethanol, apple brandy, vodka, whatever, depending on whatever pie you're making, and you can add that to the pie to your dough, to essentially the dust in your bowl at that point in time, and you can make it wet enough to easily handle, to be able to knead it that once or twice time and roll it out nice and do all your fun pretty stuff with, because it makes it easy to handle, but it evaporates when you bake it and it doesn't form gluten. So it's easier to work with, but it still makes a nice flaky and tender crust instead of something that's a little tough and crackery. So it's kind of a really great hack. You add just like a hint of flavor to your crust, but it makes it so much easier to work with. So now, irritatingly enough, pie crust is one of those things that just takes practice. And like, there's nothing I hate more than something that takes practice to get good at. I just want to be able to do something and just nail it in the first 2 tries at least. And so I don't use the brandy in the pie crust as often as I used to. And so now I'm specifically using it for flavor, depending on what pie that I'm making. I also went to school as a food scientist, so that's kind of where that comes from. I cook with a lot more. I tell even my doctor I only drink at work. I really actually drink a considerable amount of water, but I do find that I actually cook quite a bit with all of our spirits. In fact, it's probably okay. We're potentially, don't tell anybody. This is a cone of silence with the virtual tasting. We're hopefully going to be working with some people on some s'mores kits with one of our liqueurs. And so they came today to do a little bit of a marshmallow tasting, and I got along famously with the gal that does all the R&D, because I also love making marshmallows, and I've made marshmallows with a bunch of our spirits. And so like, oh my gosh, you have to try this, because if you do this, this, and this with this marshmallow, it's amazing. Because I've made some really awesome like McCarthy's single malt marshmallows with like a little bit of salt in it, and they're like smoky campfire marshmallows, and it's so good.
Well, you had me at marshmallow. I haven't
If you
made
haven't
it forever.
made, they're really easy to make. They're not as scary as one might think. It's just a little bit of gelatin and some sugar.
Yeah.
Yeah, don't those, that sounds so awesome. Just listening to you talking about all the things you're going to cook with it, I'm like, oh man, we need to try some of this.
Actually, I wonder if I could. I was like, I do have the internet. I can see, if you guys give me a half a second, I can see if I can find that. I didn't create that pork tenderloin recipe, but I might be able to find it on the internet and share it in the chat.
And I think the alcohol trick for the pie crust is out there somewhere
For
online
sure.
as well.
Yeah, no, I didn't invent that either. If I led you out to think that, I'm sorry. I totally.
Oh no, I'm just telling folks that you can go get the hints online.
Oh, they updated it. Fancy, la-di-da.
I made a marshmallow. Look.
Yeah, that looks like it. All right, I found it. There it is. Zoom. Here we go. So like I said, I use the apple brandy instead of the bourbon in this recipe, but it is absolutely killer. And don't throw away any of the sauce because that's arguably the best part.
That's the thing about cooking with alcohol is don't cook with something you won't drink.
Oh, absolutely.
I often cook with whiskey, except none of it goes into the dish.
Hey, Julia, Twinkle, there's a glass for me and a glass for the pot.
Again, I
Exactly.
want
A little bit for the dish, a little bit for me.
I want to say thank you to Vadim and then all of you here at the Virtual Tasting Society. This is my third one. You guys have all been so wonderful. I genuinely look forward to doing this with you guys. And so I appreciate you donating your time to let me muse and wax poetic about my job and what we do here at Clear Creek Distillery. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Caitlin. We appreciate you. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
And then, like I said, I run the Instagram accounts for McCarthy's, Trails End, and Clear Creek. So if you have any questions and you want to ask a distiller, send a DM to those accounts. I'm the one that reads and responds to all of them. So I'm just an Instagram chat away if you ever have any questions about anything that I do, about spirits in general.
That's crazy. You're head. Didn't you get promoted? You're now master distiller.
Yeah, I'm just head distiller.
Just head distiller. Okay, but
Huh?
didn't you leave? Somebody left recently.
Oh yeah, so Joseph O'Sullivan, my predecessor, he was hired away this summer. He is now the master distiller of Minden Mills Distillery, which was Bentley Heritage down in Minden, Nevada.
Mhm.
So he's running a massive facility down there in Nevada with an amazing team of people. And then we hired a new distiller this fall, so we're back up to 3.
Okay. So we did vote for our favorite brandy of the night. I don't think it's a fair competition, but which one do you think was the winner?
I mean, I'm going to be shocked if it's not the 15-year.
All right, the results are in by a long shot.
No, it is such a special dram. Every 6 months, usually, summer solstice and winter solstice, the team get together and we share a dram and a cigar in the parking lot. We are kind of, I say, in the back of Hood River. So we're out in amongst the orchards, but we're kind of in the middle of this random industrial complex back here. And so there's been a few businesses that have come and gone since we've been here the last 6 years, but there's like a bulk carpet emporium, like a travel van, like build trick out travel van business that takes up the half of this building and this whole building over here. But right next to us is like an excavating company. And so we usually, we quit a little bit early and we roll out the office chairs in the middle of the parking lot, a fair distance away from the distillery full of explosive liquid. And the rule is that 1, the boss has to buy the cigars. And 2, you get to have a dram of anything that you want out of the distillery. And for a very long time now, and it's going to be really weird, those barrels are gone now, so we're going to have to find something else. But for the longest time, it has been a pull from one of those 4 barrels and a cigar on the solstices, on the big solstices. So it's always been very special to the distillery team here. And I'm so excited that I had the opportunity to share it with even more people.
Will you offer more 15-year now that you know that, it tastes great?
Well, I would love to say yes. But like I said, when we have something that ages that far out, the goal is to be selling it all as 2 and 8 year. So we are going to have this blend that's of 12 and 13-year-old that we're hopefully going to come out with this year. So I will tell you it's going to be a bit if the leadership has anything to say about it, maybe never sell another single barrel of 15-year-old apple brandy. But who knows, maybe we'll lose a barrel or 2.
Of course, accidentally.
Yeah,
right.
absolutely.
Of course. Yeah.
We've done it once before. There is a barrel of McCarthy's hidden away in a secret corner of the barrel room. And I think it turns 12 this year. if not, I'm not mistaken. I'm gonna have to look at the barrel book, but I think it turns 12 this year. So we've managed to hide it for all this time. We release a 3-year and a 6-year. It's now 12, and all this time we've been hiding it and protecting it essentially as our own kind of Voyager probe into the great beyond on what McCarthy's could be at older age statements. So, you know, we tasted it at 8, we tasted it at 10. This year we'll get to taste it at 12, and then hopefully it's my job now as team leader, head distiller, Clear Creek Distillery, to convince leadership that we absolutely need to be saving just a little bit of McCarthy's back for a few cases of 12-year McCarthy's to release out in the market. So looking forward to that tasting as well. But yeah, if we can protect one barrel of McCarthy's, who knows what I can be bold enough to protect to get you guys some more 15-year apple brandy. But for now, it's up on shared pour. If you search shared pour Clear Creek 15-year-old apple brandy, it should pull up on Google. And so there's a few bottles left of that single barrel that we sold for the aficionados group up there, if you want to buy a bottle.
And you should all have shared pour accounts by now because you bought our pick from shared pour. So just log into your account that you already have.
Yeah, and actually, if you guys buy stuff from Shared Pour, I think there's also still a few bottles left of their pick for our McCarthy's. It's a single barrel of McCarthy's that was aged only in an X rum cask. So a rare opportunity to try our American single malt without any influence from the Oregon oak. It's only for the 5 years and 8 months that I think that's about how old it is. It was only an ever in an X rum cask. So I think that's also up on Shared Pour.
Yeah, I must say that 15-year was exceptional. I was really taken aback by how good that was. It was fun. Also, the reserve blend it actually reminded me a little bit of like a high ester rum. I was had some rum the other day, and there's certain things that come out of it that almost like just a little funk, you know, that, but in a good way. And so that was really interesting. And then I had that Old Delicious was excellent too. I think you know, I would put the reserve blend and Old Delicious in that number two and 3 spots. But then I tried your apple brandy against competitors, and the 8-year is definitely the winner compared to another brand. I'll leave that out for now. But but I was quite pleased. It was definitely enjoyable to get through. I think it was more interesting having gone through it now than I even anticipated to begin with. So very cool. Thank you.
Oh, well, that's wonderful. I'm glad it wasn't boring.
I know you were talking about, you know, apple brandy being like a winter spirit, but most of these were just so light and crisp and like refreshing and delightful that like this is something I want when it's like it's summer, it's hot out. I want to sit in the backyard with this and just sip it and enjoy it.
Mm-hmm. There's actually, I should have thought of this with the cocktails. We've been doing this kind of add a splash, like and to say it's a marketing program is a stretch because it's like we haven't had any ads or anything like that for it. But with all of the Clear Creek brandies, if you add it to some club soda, it's for like a low ABV cocktail. It's really good. If you add it a little bit to some Prosecco or champagne, it adds, you know, a little bit of alcohol, but a lot of flavor to that drink. It makes a really quick, simple cocktail as well. So and then just like brandy sidecars, which is essentially just kind of like a lemon drop, but with brandy instead of vodka, where it's lemon juice, simple syrup, and your brandy of choice. All of those things will play really well with these. So yeah, hot or cold, spring, summer, fall, or winter, apple brandy is for everybody.
I want to try some of these with my ginger beer, actually.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. Mm-hmm. Well, any more questions, comments, concerns? Apple brandy, Clear Creek Distillery.
So how does the barrel that we just tried of the 15-year compared to the aficionados group?
They're going to be really similar. I tasted all 4 of them. And while if you went side by side, there, of course, there's like small differences. They're all exceptional. And I honestly don't remember what barrel number that I gave you. It could have actually been the aficionados number. That was just we kept QC bottles left over. Or did I send you an actual packaged one? Oh, I did. Big spender. Look at me. It's a good thing nobody from my company is on this Zoom call. So that one is the Oregon single barrel. We did hold back some QC bottles out of every single barrel here at the distillery. But yeah, it's gonna be so the same that you're not gonna be disappointed.
Great, thank you.
Mhm.
Oh, no joke. The aficionados is 409 and this is 410.
Okay, yeah, see? So they were literally on the same barrel rack together.
So what do you prefer? Do you prefer Auto V? Do you prefer Brandy? Eau de Vie?
I usually stick to Brandy because, like I said, Brandy already kind of scares the average American consumer as a word. And so if I was going to throw out Eau de Vie, that's even scarier. Schnapps, it means the same thing. Brandy, Eau de Vie, Schnapps, all the same thing. Schnapps is the German word for all of these things. Eau de Vie is the French word for all these things. Brandy is the English word for all these things. Like I said, all of these brandies have rich European heritages. They've been distilled by farmers going back to, the 1400s, 1500s. Humans have always been super into alcohol, right? And when you can talk at length of the economic impact of abuse and alcoholism and of over imbibing, and those things are all true. But no matter how true those things are, humans are always going to be into alcohol. We can't help it. That's the cool thing about fermentation, about distilling. Literally every piece of fruit is a fermented beverage packaged up in a nice, neat little piece, right? So if you just put a bunch of apples in a container, they're going to ferment. All of that kind of white dust on the outside, those are naturally occurring yeasts and bacteria that are just chomping at the bit to turn those sugars into alcohol. And you're not going to tell me that roving bands of cavemen didn't go past some sort of ancient version of an apple tree and with a bunch of fallen apples on the ground and eat them and be like, hey, remember that one night that we had the major ragerest of parties around the campfire? Like, let's go back to that place next year. Yeah, let's do that. Like, you go back. I mean, the first recorded distiller is in ancient Egypt. We don't know what her name was, but her title was Taputi. She was the head scientist, and they were distilling. I don't know if they were distilling. They were probably distilling for consumption, but they were also distilling perfumes and essential oils and stuff for what was their medicine, right? So the technology of distilling, it wasn't like one guy discovered it. It wasn't like one culture discovered it. Cultures have discovered it and rediscovered it the world around for all the way through time, like thousands and thousands and thousands of years. Cultures will have something fermented, and then they will put it in a container and realize that the vapor on the top of the clay pot or whatever is like, whoa, that's some special stuff. How can we figure out how to collect more of that? It's a very simple technology. And so all these thousands of years later, what my job, the evolution of what my job is, the paperwork is really more of the evolution of the technology than any of the equipment that we use to actually make the spirit. What we do for fermenting, what we do for distilling, like that technology is not new. That technology is ages old. But filing tax paperwork, that's fairly new.
Great, thanks for the tax reminder.
Sorry, tis the season.
No, scientists actually have found that all sorts of animal species love the alcohol. So it's not just humans.
Elephants ferment fruit in their trunks. They hold fruit in their trunks and then
that's
consume
awesome.
it because it gives them a buzz. Yeah, no,
well, they don't actually have to do anything, right? Just leave it in their trunk and they just breathe the alcohol off of it.
Yeah,
they don't even have to. Yeah,
fruit, grain, like we didn't even know as humans. We didn't even know that bacteria and yeast existed until a couple hundred years ago. I can't remember when. I think it's von Leeuwenhoek had invented the microscope and was able to identify cells and bacteria and yeasts. Like that is knowing how it works is much more recent information than just enjoying that it works.
I feel like somebody needs to yell for science now.
it's a great charge of an army for science.
Well, that
How,
was
how much do you ship to the Midwest every year?
Not as much as I'd like.
Because
We used to ship a lot more. We're in the Midwest.
Well, I'm from Wisconsin, and I know, like, from when last time I looked at it, it could have changed. It's like the #1 importer of brandy in the world.
Yeah, so that is like the one place in the United States where brandy isn't scary is Michigan and Wisconsin. Michigan and Wisconsin are all about their brandy old fashions. They're all about brandy. All of those German immigrants from, a couple hundred years ago, everybody is very aware of what brandy is. So the only time I get caught up on my speech about Americans are scared of the brandy word is when somebody is from either Michigan or Wisconsin. And they're like, wait a second, what are you talking about? Brandy is all we drink. And I'm like, yeah, except for those 2 states, everybody else is real scared of it. We had a distributor in Michigan for a few years. We had a distributor in Wisconsin for a little bit longer. I don't know how much we still ship. When I first started at Clear Creek, one of my side hustles for the company was doing the domestic shipping of all of our orders. So 7 years ago, I could have told you exactly how many cases and where they went. But it's been quite some time since I've been separated from that part of the distillery. But I do know that we've got distributors in like 42 states, and we export to 10 countries, I think, as a company. So we try to make it as easy as possible to order from.
Oh,
So there's only a
fantastic.
handful of states that we don't have a footprint in. Florida has always been really hard to crack for both Clear Creek and Hood River Distillers. All of the major distributorships in Florida, their comments are when approached are like, we know exactly what our customers want, and you're not it. So quit bothering us. So there are some states that we just haven't been able to make any headway in.
We're
Well, I
we're
have
on the border of southern Wisconsin and Illinois, and you're hard to get.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Benny's around here has your brandy occasionally.
Yeah, Benny's is where I send everybody from there.
Yeah.
We used to sell a lot more through Benny's. In fact, Benny's got a single barrel of beer schnapps, a 13-year-old single barrel of beer schnapps in like 2012. That was super special. I just have one bottle of that in my personal library. But yeah, Benny's is pretty much the lighthouse there for that region. But like I said, we're now with Big Thirst, and I can't remember if they're able to ship to the Wisconsin, Michigan area, Illinois area, but they're able to ship to, I think, 35 states across the country. So it's been a huge improvement for customers that are just been aching for 1 or 2 bottles of our brandy to actually have easier access to it. And direct shipping is kind of going to be the wave of the future. I understand people that are hesitant about it, but in the generations of people, as a millennial, I do remember the time before Amazon, but that was high school. Future generations, everything you can order online, and it's weird that you can't order like it's weird.
Right.
It's weird as a customer in Oregon that whatever Oregon, the OLCC Liquor Commission approves is what I have access to in a liquor store. And if they don't approve it, I can't get it. All of our liquor laws across the country, it's this weird patchwork because out of prohibition, it was a states' rights issue. And so it was down to the counties, really. And so there's still dry counties across the country where they still continue to not allow liquor or limit the hours of sale of liquor and change the taxes and change the tax code and change the licensing that it would need to be able to ship. Sometimes you can ship in, but you can't ship out. It's a mess. So I would love to see, and I think we are seeing the evolution of direct to consumer shipping, where companies are doing the work to not only get some of that opened up and legislation changed and updated for, it's been a spell since prohibition, and technology has improved, but also have done the work to do all the paperwork that it takes to be able to ship from those places and to have the infrastructure to have warehouses in states that have reciprocity with all these other places to grow that network. So we've been really excited with the opportunity with Big Thirst, and being able to get bottles of pear brandy to places where it's difficult to find.
Oh, that's
All right,
fantastic.
beer
Thank you.
schnapps. Did nobody else catch that? What the heck is beer schnapps?
Beer schnapps is so like I said, schnapps is the German word for brandy, essentially.
Yeah.
But in this case, beer is B-I-E-R, is also beer, B-E-E-R or B-E-E-R, yeah, two E's. So it's a distillate made from finished beer. So if you make a really, I prefer beer schnapps that are made from like IPAs. We have some that from IPAs, from a few like spring ales, and then we have one from it with a that's like a double red. And so the stuff with the darker grain bills, you know, you get like a that rich kind of caramely toasty oats characteristic from. But all of the ales and the IPAs, all those fruity, floral, citrusy esters come through the distillate. And so it's like drinking an 80 proof beer with no bitterness, but all the flavor. So you can almost kind of, your brain tricks you into thinking there's almost a little bit of foam from the head of the beer because you're getting all the malty characteristics from the grain, but also all those, you know, beautiful citrusy terpenes and everything from the hops that were in that beer. And then, you know, with a, you know, dash of vanilla and caramel and spices from the barrel. So yeah, we sold a 13-year-old a single barrel of beer schnapps to Binny's in like 2012.
So speaking of kind of educational questions, I see that you guys sell a pear liqueur. It
Mhm.
says it's made from pear brandy.
Mhm.
What's the difference between those two?
So pear brandy is fermented and distilled pears with the pear liqueur, and we bottle it 80 proof and bone dry. So it's just booze and water, right? With the pear liqueur, we're adding like real fruit and sugar to it. So with like all of our fruit liqueurs, I should say this, all of our fruit liqueurs, with the exception of pear brandy, are made with a grape brandy base. But because we make so much pear brandy, and it would be weird to use grape brandy in a pear liqueur when we make pear brandy, that one is made with a pear brandy base, and then pears and sugar added on top of it. With all of our other fruit brandies, it's a grape brandy base, and then we cram jam as much of those berries or fruits as possible in there, let them soak, press the fruit off, and then back sweeten it with a little bit of sugar. So it's essentially what everybody's grandma would make in like mason jars with leftover blackberries or whatever. But we're doing all the work and the mess and bottling it up in pints for you.
Nice. Thanks for the education. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no worries. Well, any more questions?
I think we're good. Well, thank you so much. Now I want some of your delicious liqueurs too.
They're super good. I don't know. I don't know. It's up to you if you want to do a liqueur tasting. 6 fruit liqueurs in a row. So it's like you have to make sure you have some chicken strips or something to get some protein.
Well, we got to have you come out here and do something in person. We'll do like
Oh, I would love that. I would love that.
Absolutely, that would be awesome.
Yeah.
Everybody can practice their pies before Caitlin comes out, and then we can impress her with all the pies you all made.
I would love it. I love it. I actually took a pie on live TV once. They had me on the like live TV in Portland to talk about our vodka for the holidays. And they were like, bring some like fun cocktail recipes and everything. And I'm like, well, okay, I'll bring a couple of cocktail recipes, but I'm bringing a pie. And because I'm going to talk about the pie crust trick. And then I left it at the news station and they were like, oh my God, what have you done to us?
Nice. All right. Well, then I guess we're waiting for you to come over and visit us with pie.
Yeah, absolutely. Just send the invite.
You're always invited. Let us know.
That's awesome. Well, thank
We'll
you
roll
guys
out the red carpet
again
for you.
for donating your evening. I really appreciate your time and all of your questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Caitlin.
Thanks,
Bye.
Caitlin. You're always a lot of fun.
Okay. Bye, guys.